What's interesting here is, look, when we talk about Mark Carney, his name is almost synonymous with Brookfield Asset Management. But the truth is, Mark Carney didn't sign on to Brookfield until after he left the Bank of England. Prior to that, Mark Carney is a part of Goldman Sachs, right, which is another huge just a financial juggernaut in the world. So what we have here is a guy who is, in and out of different bureaucracies, whether it's the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, the United Nations, these governmental organizations or quasi-governmental organizations. And then, well, at the same time, with another foot in Wall Street, another foot in finance, which is highly dangerous. And this is the thing that I think most mainstream Canadian liberals have chosen to overlook, because I don't think they really understand the level of the conflict of interest involved in the things that Mark Carney has done and continues to do. So, Sam, let's take a step forward. After the Bank of England, he goes over to Brookfield. You spoke earlier about this network. Can you break down who the key figures inside that network and all of their connections to China?
Well, I mean, Brookfield's, this is just a network of elites, many from Quebec, that have been the wealthy people of Canada for decades, right? And so by Mark Carney jumping in and taking the leadership of that, as I testified in Parliament, within the recent months, for the Ethics Committee, they were interested in my reporting on Mark Carney's role with Brookfield and how that crossed over to the networks you're talking about. And so I didn't talk about Dominic Barton or Michael Sabia or some of the other people we've talked about before in this Eastern Canada network of networks of people that have been very, I think you called them, if we're talking about Canada's deep state, it's not a stretch to say, this starts from business titans in Eastern Canada and how they influence the policy, as it turns out, mostly of the Liberal government, because the Liberal government is in power 80% of the time. So, I mean, we could talk a lot about Dominic Barton and Mark Carney and Michael Sabia. But to lean on what I testified, the most, what jumped out to me in Brookfield's dealings with China, which would raise the peak concern of potential conflicts, included back in the 2015-2016 era, Brookfield gets into, I believe, about a $750 million investment in high-end real estate in Shanghai. And so as this was at the peak of China's real estate market, which has since had some very hard times. And so this investment is in trouble 2024. Mark Carney, who is now the boss of Brookfield, is part of the team that goes over to Beijing, meets with Xi Jinping. He also meets, I believe, with the senior leadership of the Bank of China. I believe also with the mayor of should be Shanghai. So he meets with the elite of the Chinese Communist Party. Brookfield's near $1 billion investment in Shanghai is in deep trouble. And after these meetings, the Bank of China issues something like a $125 million bridge loan to Brookfield so that it can, I guess, refinance at a pretty good rate some of its project there in Shanghai. And so, as I told the people in the ethics committee, that's a loan that I think any sensible person would say there could be politically sensitive, whether you want to call it strings or just a line. The Bank of China in itself is a Chinese Communist Party entity. Mark Carney traveling over to Beijing prior to this loan being issued, it's beneficial both to Xi Jinping, and at the end of the day, whether a string is tied or not, it turns out to be beneficial to Brookfield, obviously, to get this bridge loan. Taking a step back into that relationship, who of Western companies can invest in real estate in China? Only people given the gatekept access by the Chinese Communist Party. Furthermore, Shanghai is a high-end real estate market where, only the CCP elites and very, very connected people in China have these types of properties. So for Brookfield to be in on that asset, that shows a type of access and a type of privileged access. Furthermore, as I told the committee, I was interested that an investor from Hong Kong, who was the partner with Brookfield in this, is part of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is a central united front body. This is what the Chinese Communist Party uses to bring people from all walks of life, whether it's business, any other area. And it's not nominally the CCP, but it's controlled by the CCP. So it's like the CCP kind of tossing out goodies to people that come into this political body. Furthermore, when I'm really digging into my memory of the story, I found it interesting that this Hong Kong tycoon who had invested with, Brookfield, in his own comments, he called investment into Hong Kong's market a way for Beijing to ensure that, Western elite business persons would still be able to invest in China, but on Beijing's terms. So that in itself, I say, there's a lot of data points there that suggest that Carney and Brookfield being invested in that near billion dollar real estate play before he gets a, sort of an emergency loan secured. Now he's Prime Minister of Canada. What could stop people in Beijing from using that as some sort of leverage? And that's one deal. But I'll just take one more giant step back, and something that I learned from this new book from Dennis Molinaro, Under Assault, is that the Canada-China Business Council, which is, you asked me at the start of this question to point to some of the networks involved. I learned that the Canada-China Business Council was in part the creation of what's called a suspected Chinese spy, who is an academic from originally the University of BC, later McGill, who this book reveals was tasked to get Canada or the United States to recognize the CCP over Taiwan. And so this was an influence operation. Looks like it targeted Pierre Trudeau. Looks like it was successful, is what the author indicates. And I learned from the author that the Canada-China Business Council itself was, partly created by this agent whose job was to influence Western elites so that they would choose China's policies. So if Brookfield is investing in China in a project like that, I say it looks like, the type of thing that would be funneled through the Canada-China Business Council or gatekeepers such as this man, Paul Lin. I don't know that he's involved or a successor of him is involved, but that's the system to invest with Beijing, and that's the system that Mark Carney's part of.
Now, something I want to point out here. Typically, Chinese communist dictators are not people that you can just get on the phone or enter a room and speak with. There are members of the CCP and United Front Work Department and other agencies, high up top members who have still never met Xi Jinping. So for a guy like Mark Carney to be able to, one, not only invest, $750 million in Shanghai real estate. But then to request an audience with Xi Jinping himself when that investment starts to go south, that signals some pretty significant power, right?
Yeah, and we don't know if Carney requested the audience or vice versa. But your point that you don't get in a room with Xi Jinping unless you're a very serious player or they want you to be in that room. Any number of I'm looking at other stories that have come out of U.S. indictments where it looks like a former director of the CIA who now is, I think, suffering Alzheimer's. So he's called an unindicted co-conspirator in a case that I was looking at involving many different people involved in, the East Coast let's call it the academic and business elites of China, targeting people like Hunter Biden. I mean, this person, James Woolsey, the indictment I read suggested that, he would be granted access, I believe, with Xi Jinping as part of, it looks like, some sort of influence play. And in that case, it was all about, a senior Chinese spy was trying to get someone in a senior security position in the Trump 1.0 administration. And James Woolsey, who was kind of tied up, again, the former CIA director, tied up in an influence operation, was puppeting op-eds from China Daily, or in fact, I believe wrote op-eds for China Daily suggesting why China's Belt and Road project was good, attractive policy for America to get involved in. So, I mean, for you to meet with Xi Jinping, it's because you're the type of person that will use your position, like a Larry Summers did, to argue that the Belt and Road is good policy, or like a Mark Carney did to argue that Beijing's renminbi remittance system should have swap lines with the UK's central bank. These are high level financial and geopolitical objectives of Beijing. So yeah, those 10 or 12 business people that are pictured along with Mark Carney and Xi Jinping are in that class of global elite Western business people that China either wants to curry favor with or already has, I believe.
Okay, so while we're here, I want to talk about Bloomberg a little bit because, again, when we talk about Mark Carney, his name is always synonymous with Brookfield, but he is also part of Bloomberg, or was. Now, Sam, can you talk about Bloomberg, why they're important to the story, and what their connection is to China?
Yeah, so Bloomberg and Mark Carney are the two, sort of senior global business person entities that were involved with this Jin Li-kun, who I mentioned at the start of our conversation, former head of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And they were involved with him. Again, this is not conjecture. People can pull up the press releases and see Michael Bloomberg, Jin Li-kun, Mark Carney, ESG green investment in Brazil. That's one clear project that I remember. So who's Bloomberg? Why are he and Mark Carney sort of fellow business travelers? I mean, there's a tremendous rabbit hole about how a great reporter for Bloomberg named Michael Forsyth, he's now with the New York Times, this is back in around 2016, 2015, did an incredible deep dive into how Xi Jinping and his family and other senior Chinese Communist Party Politburo leaders have billions of dollars around the world. So this was pointing directly at Xi Jinping. And there's all kinds of writing from Michael Forsyth and his wife, who's also sort of in I believe, the think tank NGO type field. how this story for Bloomberg was much too hot to handle, and it got spiked by Bloomberg. The threat, I guess, was that Bloomberg sells its high-value data terminals in China. They're used in China, as they are around the world. And I believe the story is, if this expose of Xi Jinping and his family's money was published on Bloomberg in their investigation, a huge bombshell story, that the terminals would be shut off. So it gets a little bit, as worrying. I think that Michael Forsyth and his family in China were unsafe. I believe there may have been threats. They had to leave. And then he went on and reported the same story for New York Times, really poetically sticking it to Bloomberg, the story that they spiked, an obvious story of the most importance, in understanding what really is the ruling structure in China, which is corruption at the highest levels. That story, I think it's just really the perfect anecdote to understand Michael Bloomberg's business in China and how Beijing has leverage over business people that are invested in China, which takes us back to Mark Carney and Brookfield. We don't know, because of his ethical screen with what is it, 99, 100, 102 potential conflicts. Maybe he has cut off the tentacle of being tied to that particular $1 billion, roughly, Brookfield investment in Shanghai real estate. We don't know, but I'm talking about Michael Bloomberg being leveraged by Beijing because of his deep investments in China, which is the case study that proves the point that Mark Carney should be similarly potentially leveraged if he's still invested with Brookfield, which...
Right. So, and this is the thing, like, this is what I wanted to get to because, look, Mark Carney goes over to China, meets direct with Xi Jinping, right? They sit down and he leaves having secured a $276 million loan from the bank.
It was 125.
It's 276. I checked it this morning. It's 276.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you for correcting me on
all these numbers, billions and trillions, Sam. We get lost in it. Once you're past 100 million, it doesn't matter anymore. But 276 million was a number that I read this morning. So that means that he had to have had some serious financial leverage and negotiating power in order to walk into a scenario where the firm that he chairs is losing money on a $750 million investment and then secures a $250 million loan from the Bank of China, right? And you have to understand that they're not just going to hand this out. There is a little bit of a give and take there. So what is he giving to China, I guess, is the question in that situation, right?
I mean, we don't even have to have evidence that anything was given or taken. It's the fact that the vulnerability is there. And Bank of China is a CCP entity. This is not any normal country. It's not like he had an investment in New York City and the Bank of America, or JP Morgan Chase was thinking, well, we think the real estate market is going to come back, so let's give him a loan of $300 million with terms that are good for the bank, and that's good underwriting. No, it is the Bank of China does not make that loan without senior Chinese Communist Party members saying make that loan. I don't think so. Did Mark Carney give anything for that? I don't know. But even the fact of him standing in a picture with Xi Jinping in a couple of years ago, while China's market is crashing and desperately in need of investment from foreigners, don't get it wrong. Even if China is, to jump into another topic, threatening Japan with fiery hell, they still behind the scenes will be talking to Japan and say, please don't pull your investments out, right? They deeply need money from other countries, or else their whole economy, is in danger. So Mark Carney standing in a picture with Xi Jinping as a global business leader is already giving something to Xi. Maybe not enough to secure a $276 million loan, but it's relational, right?
Yes. Well, so let me pose this to you, because now we're kind of moving on in the story here. And I have my notes here, but just for the sake of us continuing this conversation, I also believe that as the governor of the Bank of England, he secured a $1 billion investment in China's Belt and Road Initiative projects,
Wow.
right?
I didn't know that. That's a nice find.
People can fact check me. Here, let me pull it up. I'm not going to edit any of this out. Sorry, guys. I've, you know what's funny, dude? And I told you this before we started recording, and I put a post on this about this on X. But I've been doing a ton of research on this because I wanted to come correct for this conversation. Because the thing about the Trudeau special is that it was pretty straightforward. The guy's an idiot. He got caught in a million different things. So there was so much stuff we could talk about, right? But what's tricky with Mark Carney is that he's no dummy. And that the things that he's done and the moves that he's made have all been very, very calculated and cunning. And so in digging into this, it's hard to decipher between, what is legitimate above board business, because look, the truth is China's a leading world economy, right? A world leading economy, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're involved in any business, it's smart to do business with them, right? So what is above board business, just regular business, and what is some pretty scary globalist, underhanded World Economic Forum type shit? And that's what's been difficult about all this for me is deciphering between what's legit and what isn't.
Yeah, I mean, while you look up more on this deal, because I think that's huge. Let's remember, okay, to your point, what is a legit trade or business with China and what is not? Remember, we talked about Dominic Barton being examined in, Ottawa hearings and being asked by the Conservative MP Garnet Genuis, can you tell us, Mr. Barton, with your role at McKinsey, did you directly advise these Chinese state entities on their building of illegal, structures in South China Sea as part of their military expansion? And Mr. Barton hemmed and hawed and couldn't give any answer. So very clearly, when you're from a McKinsey or a Brookfield, or you're a Larry Summers at Harvard, and you are advising Western nations to be involved in Xi Jinping's Belt and Road project, the Belt and Road is part of China's military expansion. Mm-hmm. As I've said, the U.S. State Department sees it as part of China's use of organized crime around the world to recycle what I'm told, corruption money. There's bribes involved. I believe in focusing on, let's say, Southeast Asia. They can take over deep water ports by sort of, getting the local government to take massive loans, and then the loans go underwater and China takes over, a piece of potential military, infrastructure. So the Belt and Road is bad news. People, you can look it up and see enough reporting from the CBC or pick any global media company, and they'll have written on the Belt and Road and concerns with it. Again, just like the financial system, this is China competing to be hegemon with the United States, but doing it in a much more dirty, corrupt way than the United States could ever come up with, even in the past.
Yeah.
Even in the past. So I said Larry Summers, who was, I found very interestingly connected to the family that Mark Carney, we can connect. was involved in promoting the Belt and Road. People can read. James Woolsey, the now senile, or I'm sorry, suffering Alzheimer's former CIA director, was involved in some type of scheme in promoting the Belt and Road, being influenced by a senior Chinese spy, the same one, by the way, that targeted Hunter Biden.
And I just want to jump in here, like, because I don't want to downplay the significance of this. The former CIA director, the former director of the nucleus of the American global deep state, was caught in a conspiracy to promote Belt and Road Initiative ideology.
Yeah, thank you for let me unpack that for 1 minute. The case is incredible. I've reported on it a number of times at the Bureau. James Woolsey is part of this Eastern United States think tank with a guy named Gal Luft, who's an Israeli-American academic. Gal Luft is working with a Chinese quote-unquote oil company whose director is the same one that gave Hunter Biden an $80,000 ring, is the same one that's in the Hunter Biden laptop.
Yeah.
And another guy in that case is the one that targeted James Woolsey and was giving him talking points and editorials to write on why the Belt and Road Project is good American policy and what they were trying to do with the former CIA director who's at the end of his career and losing, his mental acuity, is they hoped to place a senior security figure in the Trump 1.0 administration. So think about that. They wanted someone in the Trump cabinet controlled by China, James Woolsey. And when we're talking, it's the same network targeting the Biden family, the big guy, all of this stuff. When you follow China enough, I think, as we're demonstrating in this conversation, certain themes, certain people keep popping up. And what we're talking about here is why Mark Carney, you say, which I never knew, this is quite the data point.
He
gave him, read it.
I have it right here. It says, as governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney deepened UK-China financial relations by approving a deal granting Chinese banks access to London's currency market and creating a $1 billion investment fund supporting China's Belt and Road Initiative, participated in multiple high-level dialogues, including AI and green finance discussions, earning praise for facilitating Beijing's global financial integration.
The thing that I didn't know there is the Belt and Road, which is huge. I already had enough of an idea by Mark Carney paving the way for that financial conduit between the Bank of China and the Bank of England. That's enough. But the Belt and Road on top of it, $1 billion investment, to me, that's the smoking gun, right? And so now when we look at why could the Keir Starmer government not prosecute a case of insiders in Westminster, the Britain Parliament, selling out, MPs that were critical of Beijing, it's precisely because it looks like people like Mark Carney have forged such a financial tie and a geopolitical tie between Beijing and the UK that if the UK goes to act on that laterally now in 2025, it is very difficult to do so because China has their hooks in so deep.